it's all been building it from the ground up in a way, which is why it's taken quite a long time to get to the stage where I can just make pieces and that I understand the material. It's developing a really like intimate understanding of how the material works.
Welcome back to Artfully Crafted. My name is Alienor, and each week I take you to a craftsperson's studio, interview them and show you their work. This week we're headed to Southeast London to meet milk artist Tessa Silva. I first came across Tessa's work at Future Heritage, an exhibition held at the Design Centre Chelsea Harbour and curated by Corinne Julius. Tessa's work really piqued my interest. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It looks like a hard surface, but it also looked stitched. It just made me really curious about it. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button and let's get into it. Hi Tessa.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, we're here in your studio in Southeast London.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe we could start with introducing your work to the audience. Maybe if you could tell me a bit about this.
This is a little sample piece from my project, which is called Feminized Protein. And it's very niche. I work with a very niche material and it's made from milk. It's a project I started about 9 years ago when I graduated from the Royal College of Art in 2016. And it started with a lot of research into historical uses of materials, looking at specifically natural materials prior to the kind of mass manufacture of synthetics and plastics. And there are a couple of really interesting ways and applications in which milk was used. And one really fascinated me, and it was a flooring made out of chalk and sour milk. So from that, I've developed this material, years and years of experimentation, using milk from a farm in Sussex, and it's a waste product. And so everything you can see here are little bits and pieces of experimentation of my specific material made from milk.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so much to unpack just from this short introduction. Maybe starting with a sort of like historical inspiration, what drew you to historical uses of milk? Because I did an MA in art history and I've never researched that before.
It was quite a deep dive into, I was looking at just weird materials, specifically very interested in using a natural material. I was very preoccupied in my master's course of wanting to have a story and a narrative behind the things I was making and why I was producing more stuff that was going to be put out into the world. I wanted there to be a very specific reason and a story.
It's kind of like an anti-consumerist kind of.
In a way. It was not wanting to just buy materials and put more stuff out into the world. I wanted to really intimately understand a material. So it began with so much research into different historical uses of materials, and I don't know if I even remember how the milk came about. I was looking at using blood at one point. I was looking at hair, bone, and these actually, so hair and bone are also protein materials derived from protein, which is what the milk material is. And so it's looking at those properties. The fact that milk has a high protein content is what has, in the past, made you able to be able to use it as a kind of for industrial applications.
Okay.
And this flooring existed in the 1500s, 1600s. So a lot of old Tudor houses had this sour milk chalk floor. A lot of them don't exist anymore, as you can imagine, but there are a couple, one or two National Trust houses that have maintained this flooring. It now has this like greeny hue on it from developing a bit of like mould, but they polish it and maintain it.
Amazing.
And it was just weird and interesting enough for me to want to do some
it piques
work
your
with
interest.
it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, so I guess you were looking at it from, sort of almost with a sort of chemist's
at the beginning,
sort of lens as well,
Yeah.
sort of looking out for interesting materials through art history.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and was there any sort of not political motivations for wanting to use milk specifically, but I guess like, was there anything about that material that sort of like resonated with you, like messages that you wanted to share?
I think that's really developed over time. So initially it was primarily about using a natural material, looking at the sustainability aspects. My practice is I'm very interested in our collective use of materials and the ecological and cultural implications of our use of materials. But as I've delved deeper into understanding milk and researching milk, I've learnt so much about the cultural significance of this material, about kind of modern dairy farming and the dairy industry, and how abstracted milk has really become from its source, and how we're kind of purposefully not made to be aware of the realities of milk production, and how that specifically can tie into these pieces I'm making. So each object I'm making is intended to really create value for this material and to honour the life cycle of how it's been brought into the world. And we all have this really kind of primal connection with milk, right? It's a primary liquid, it sustains life, and so we unconsciously have a connection with it somehow. And also, I mean, milk, cow's milk has been linked to humans for millennia as well. So some of the earliest human artifacts are vessels that contain cow's milk. So it's kind of it's been a part of human existence and human history. So there's quite a lot of pressure, I guess, where I feel very honoured to be working with it, and each piece has to be very considered and thought through in order to do it justice in a way. Doing this historical research, experimentation started once I was paired with a farm that create a waste stream of milk. And so I was collecting bits of this waste milk and doing very early experimentations. It was a bit of chemistry involved there, a bit of kitchen work, I was just testing out flat samples of the material. There was a lot of trial and error. A lot of stuff went wrong, which I think is a really fundamental part of developing your own material. There's no instruction manual there for me to refer to, and there wasn't that much information about how it existed in the past and how it was made. So I think there have been some, casein is the name of the specific protein material from milk, and I think there have been some casein experimentations. It has been used as like a glue binder for people doing painting. Okay. But it's not as this kind of solid material or casting or sculpting medium.
Fine. Okay, so there's not really anybody else making what you're making or using milk in the way that you're using it.
No, I don't believe so.
And so basically you're saying that the RCA was the time when you sort of first developed it, right?
Yeah, it was, there were a lot of things that I didn't like about the RCA and a lot of things that I did, and one of the positive aspects, like the benefits of going there, was that I was really encouraged to find a niche, I guess, and to develop my own language for the work that I was making. It was a time to be able to experiment and try new things without the pressure of it having to kind of go out into the world now. Which was kind of the beauty of it in a way. Yeah.
But how did you know how to begin then with your experimentations? I mean, what was that early process like?
It was testing. It was having these like weird little discs of mouldy milks like laid out on my desk. It was
well, you must have been popular.
Yeah, it wasn't great for anyone else working next to me, but yeah, it was just continuing to try to figure out a way to make it work, and recording all of these findings, being quite meticulous in that process, which I'm not very good at. It doesn't come naturally to me to like record and to be very specific and to be scientific. So that was a learning curve as well. And
yeah, because that's very much like the scientific method of like
and there are bits and pieces of information out there that I used as guidelines, and I had to involve a lot of different kind of fields and processes. So I still use quite a lot of kitchen equipment, and I have to adapt different pieces of equipment to suit me, and develop my own processes. So it's all been building it from the ground up in a way, which is why it's taken quite a long time to get to the stage where I can just make pieces and that I understand the material. It's developing a really like intimate understanding of how the material works, essentially.
So how many years has it taken you?
I first started experimenting 9 years ago, it is now.
Okay.
And it didn't really, I was working alongside it and doing other things, and it didn't really come into fruition in terms of me being able to start and produce a finished object reliably. That's only happened in the last handful of years, the last 4 years. Yeah.
Okay. Can we talk about anything that went like spectacularly wrong? Because I mean, it's milk, right? It goes mouldy. As you said, you've also had to literally invent processes, and also like your process is a multi-part process.
Yeah.
So at any stage there are ways in which it could go wrong, right? Whether that's like the actual like shaping or the drying or whatever it is.
Yeah. There have been a lot of spectacular mistakes. Understanding how to control the smell, understanding how to dry the material properly. So it has to be completely free from moisture in order for it to last. To be this solid object that could essentially last forever, all of the moisture needs to be extracted from it. It needs to be the exact right temperature, and all of these things have gone wrong in the past. And developing the process. So at first, I think I mentioned I was trying to kind of pour and cast sheets, or pour into moulds that were like silicone moulds or wooden moulds, and the material just didn't take to that. I didn't like it, and so then I developed this process of sewing and casting into fabric sewn moulds, and that came again from historical influences. So from the use of cheesecloth to set cheese traditionally, and so I mean all of it. I'm trying to like pair it all to a story, have a narrative behind each bit of the process and reason as to introducing the process. And the fabric worked really well. So I used dead stock fabric and I sew moulds from a slightly stretchy fabric, which basically enables this liquid kind of living material to be extruded into these moulds and bulge and inflate and swell. And so I have a certain amount of control over that process because I'm the one stitching the moulds. But the material also gets to do its own thing, and then gravity does its own thing, and it settles into its own forms. And that was a long learning process as well, with how much control and influence, I guess, to dictate in that sewing process, and understanding the very basic pattern cutting techniques that I've had to teach myself, and how to translate 2D piece of fabric into a 3D object. And a lot of the time, I'd start with something really big that I'd sewn, that I want this exact shape, and I'd extrude the material into it, and it would just go like that. And it was just, because it's a liquid, it wouldn't work. So that also has been a process of understanding almost like the geometry of how the material's built up and the structure, and how much it can take and how much influence I can have over it.
And also, I guess, how much, because you mentioned, it being a liquid, but then you're shaping it. I guess there must be a point at which you can shape it, and beforehand it maybe can't be shaped, or there's probably things like that where it's kind of like working out like the sort of like timeliness of each stage, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's It's really tricky because actually I'm used to sort of, you know, so I'm talking with, you know, someone who's a stone carver or ceramicist. Like I'm used to going into a lot of detail about the process. But we're sort of having to be quite protective over the way that we're talking about how you make things, because you've mentioned to me that people are constantly reaching out, sort of like asking.
Yeah, I think, there's a bit of a balance there that I'm trying to strike, which is wanting to be able to like inspire people, being a bit open access and generous with the work, but also it is a process that I've done so much research into and I've worked so hard to refine that
9 years.
Yeah, that I'm not willing to share the exact like ingredients, temperatures, specifics of what makes the material work really well. And I've had people contacting me asking quite bluntly for like the exact way in which I do it so that they can replicate it. And it really depends if it's kind of a hobbyist who's interested in working with a natural material. That's very different to if it's a student who wants to base their whole project on it.
But if we're trying to sort of, you know, make it, you know, something that people can sort of understand, you've likened it to a little bit like working in ceramics, in terms of it's something that starts as being sort of a liquid form and then it's sort of like shaping it and getting to that dry stage.
I'd say it's a bit of a balance. It's a combination of ceramics or plaster casting and working with gesso, even like working with jelly and like forming jelly in moulds. It's a bit of an overlap of all of those things. So it starts in a plaster-like consistency and it's pourable or extrudable. And then, similarly to ceramics, it has to be dried. So I use a dehydrator, and similarly to a kiln, but very, very low temperatures and for a lot less time, the moisture needs to be extracted. So it then kind of sits and has its drying time. So it's not an immediate process. It also, and it changes in the kiln as well. So it has this similarly to ceramics.
And you said the dehydrator, like you said it's quite a specific temperature because I think you mentioned to me like the colour can go wrong or...
Yeah, you could burn it. You could not extract enough moisture so that it stays. And that's a really tricky one, so you wouldn't necessarily know that straight away. So
because it would be at the core, basically.
Yeah, it'd be at the core, and then that means you think you have a finished object, and a few months in, it's started to like crack because moisture is still inside, so it's kind of destroying itself from the inside out. Or the smell doesn't go away. So if these objects are successfully dried, they will eventually have no smell of milk. But obviously at the beginning, they start with a smell. So there are so many tiny little intricacies that I've had to learn.
And then you told me that you're using a waste product of milk and then mixing it with chalk. And instantly I thought, oh, gesso. But you were actually saying that it's majority or like sort of like a higher proportion of milk than chalk. But again, that's an interesting sort of like parallel. So it's like elements of ceramics, elements of gesso, I guess, like that's probably the sort of realm to talk about it.
Exactly. The chalk is almost like reverse of the gesso. The chalk is almost like the binder, so it kind of just creates a consistency that's workable with, essentially, so that you can pour or extrude the material. But so that's why we're having to be sort of not too specific, a little bit protective, which makes sense. You know, if I had spent that much time developing, you know, a very like niche knowledge base, like you need to protect it. That's but very exciting. And I also would love to hear a little bit more, because you said the source of where of a specific farm that it comes from is very important to you, and the sort of like cycle of milk production. Can you go more into that? So the project, or I think I said, really came together when I was paired up with this farm in East Sussex, and visited the farm and learnt that they have this waste stream. So it's a really small farm. I think it's got under 40 cows or something. It's a raw organic dairy farm, and they essentially, to to produce cream and butter and all the fatty stuff that is good for selling, they have a separation machine, and it separates the watery kind of protein-rich material, which is what I need. They normally just throw that back in the grass because it's not, you know, they can't sell it. It's not very useful for them. So it was finding out that even in quite small quantities on a small local scale farm, there's this system that exists that's producing a byproduct, producing a waste that is something that I can take, and it's inserting myself in that system and kind of like leeching off the system in order to not have to really source other materials, knowing that it's all local as well, being able to have access to a cheap material as well that's normally thrown away is all really important to me. And this specific farm, I've only ever worked with them because it's quite small. The project is very intentionally not meant to be scaled up and like mass produced. It's not, you know, this natural plastic alternative. It's a finite material source, and I can get a certain amount of it every month through deliveries, but you know, I have to be very intentioned with what I make from that material. Yeah.
Do you think that it would maybe sort of I don't know if the word is like be a little bit too commodified if you should just use like milk from a supermarket, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think it defeats the point. It's not knowing where that's being sourced from. It's like the modern dairy industry is kind of horrific. It's like, I think as I mentioned, the dairy industry intentionally abstracts the final product from its source so that we don't have to think about the realities of milk production. Yeah. And that's through commercialization and industrialization of it. And so, yeah, using that kind of milk that is then marketed in a plastic bottle, you know, it defeats the whole point of the project, which is kind of immediate local sourcing and understanding the process behind the material that you're using. It's not just buying something. It's me really seeing from the very source of where I'm getting this material, understanding the realities of it and where it comes from, which I think not many people engage in that anymore, or there's a bit of an apathy around understanding what things are made of and where material comes from.
I think it's a really, you know, you have massive companies pouring, you know, millions into making sure that we as the end consumer don't really understand what we're consuming. Yeah. And so then takes a lot of work as the individual to, as you say, fully understand, you know, when I think about, you know, the stuff I wear, the stuff I have in my house, the stuff I eat and drink, etc. It's like, you know, every single item, if I were to research every single thing, that's, you know, that's a lot of time, right? And I think that's done intentionally. Like, no one wants us to have that information, like, too easily. Yeah. Like,
I mean, it's exhausting if you were to think about every aspect of your life in that way.
But we should.
But exactly.
In an ideal world, that's what we want people to be able to do, to make conscious decisions about what and how they consume it. But
there are structures in place to stop us from doing that. Which is why, you know, I've been so quite intentionally focused on the sourcing of the material and understanding that, and understanding that there are ethical implications that apply here as well. I'm working with a very culturally loaded and significant material, but really, like, in each piece that I'm creating, in creating this object of like beauty that will last forever if it's looked after, it's trying to imbue that with value again, something that has been devalued over time. It's giving it value and an homage, I guess, to where it comes from. To maternal figures in general as a whole. Yeah.
And you mentioned actually, and we can see the stitching and the fabric, and you said that that's something that you've been sort of developing and exploring as well.
The fabric stuff has been a bit of a pleasant surprise for me in a way, because at the beginning it was a means to an end. It was a very practical decision that I was going to use fabric because it would allow the material to inflate and contain. Yeah. And I've kind of managed to teach myself accidentally to work quite well with fabric and to do. I've just done so much sewing and understanding pattern cutting, and so yeah, a lot of my influences now are looking at different kind of stitching and smocking techniques, and looking at the sourcing of fabric as well now, which is really important to me. So I use dead stock fabric, but I'm doing more research into knowing exactly where that fabric comes from as well, and my choice of fabric uses, the choice of the stitching, and how each stitch can also represent something in history and link to the story as well. And I've got a lot of influences, funnily, from the fashion industry, and different ways of manipulating fabric.
Yeah.
Which
because that is actually, it then becomes embedded in the piece, so it actually influences its aesthetic quite a lot, right?
And I really like, there's this, you can see there are kind of these tension lines around the seams, and it almost represents the material trying to kind of burst out or swell out, or the tension of it being contained in this way. I've really enjoyed learning about a little bit more about working with fabric and textiles, and it's endless, like what I could potentially do with that as well, in terms of imprinting different textures and showing the process a little bit more on the surface of these pieces.
So, are you an artist? Are you a designer? Are you a maker? Or are you a craftsperson?
We're often asked to define ourselves within these categories quite a lot. And I don't know. I think my work sits within all of those fields. I call myself an artist, a designer, a craftsperson. I'd say the amount of skill and time that it takes to kind of perfect each piece it's definitely, I'm working as a craftsperson. But I come from a design background, and so although I have made sculptural pieces that are purely sculptural, I really enjoy making pieces with a functional purpose as well. That, for me, it's a really nice perimeter or boundary to work around, just having one function that the piece needs to kind of fulfill, and then everything else around that is open to interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's something. So I came across your work at Future Heritage, which is curated by Corinne Julius, and what I really loved about your pieces was, there was the material itself. It was just piqued my interest. I was like, oh, what is it? How is it made? And then, as you say, you can sort of see like the sort of fabric and the folds, etc. And you're sort of like, is it milk? Is it fabric? What is it? But at the same time, as you say, the sort of like use, you know, it was a table, it was a mirror, it was like very clearly, there was function in it too, which I always think is, just to have that combination of the two was great.
I think there's a bit more of a understanding that those two, that art and design can be fused, and there are kind of a lot of curators and galleries working within that quite like niche sector, because the value of an object, if it's a sculpture, is often very different to the value of an object if it's a piece of design or if it's functional. And I refer to them as sculptural functional pieces. But I guess Future Heritage is very mainly based, Corinne chooses people that are craftspeople, but there's always some function to the work which ties it together.
And because you mentioned being sort of a designer by training, but if we take it back to your BA, you actually studied architecture, right?
I did interior architecture as a BA, and went on from that to do MA design products. But the architecture was a choice. It was me wanting to be employable after graduating. It was kind of making what I thought was a clever decision about my future career and being interested in space. But on that course, what I found most fascinating, what I enjoyed the most, was making with my hands. So creating the little maquettes.
I love that. As soon as you said like making, your face lit up.
It wasn't doing the drawing or like sitting in front of a computer. I mean, I was actually lucky enough that I just caught the last bit of architecture where we were still drawing with like pens and pencils and doing perspective, and we did minimal amounts of stuff on the computer, but by the end of it, it was all laptop work, and I wasn't interested in that, and I wasn't really interested in creating structures. I'm terrible with right angles. Like I can't, when something needs to be when something needs to be like level or like built properly, I can't really get my head around it. So the geometry of architecture and everything, it was quite challenging for me, and making is what made me happy. And so I went on to the design course with the intention that I was always going to be working with my hands, and I chose a specialism that was called design through making. So it was based on experimentation. We had to turn up to tutorials with things that we had done and made physically, not just concepts. Which really worked for me in the way my practice still works today, really.
And so have you had to sort of like let go of, that sort of desire you had to be employable? Like what's your relationship to that now?
It's interesting. I didn't do full architecture because I didn't want to do a full 7-year course, but I've actually ended up doing the BA, the MA, working for another artist, working for myself, and it's been even longer. Once I graduated from product design course, I assisted another artist for many years, and I learned a lot from that. And it's since kind of post-pandemic 2021 that I've been working for myself in my studio, developing my studio practice, but without the other work and without learning from the artists that I assisted how to kind of conduct a business, how to deal with clients, how to experiment efficiently. Like very important. Yeah, how to, if you do, it was really eye-opening in terms of failure as well. If you do something and it doesn't work, you don't pack up and go home that day and tell yourself that it hasn't worked. I learnt through working with the artist that it was like, right, so we go again and we do another thing. He was so enthusiastic and efficient that it was like, let's go again and let's make more and let's try this and let's try this. And I've really tried to bring that into my own practice as well.
It's actually learning to cope with failure and setbacks, isn't it?
Yeah, which is a huge part of every day of working for yourself. It's learning how to advocate for yourself or like believe in yourself as well, which is really, really hard when you're just working on your own every day, and accepting the failures, because it's a huge part of being an artist or a craftsperson or a designer or whatever I am. It ties into every aspect of the work.
What, maybe if we apply that to sort of opportunities, oh my God.
Doing well.
Yeah, exactly. Failing at being an interviewer today. Great. What if we apply that to sort of opportunities that you've had to submit applications for, etc. Sort of failing versus successes.
The failing has happened way more than any successes. People don't really tell you or teach you in art school or design school that you really need to carve out a huge portion of your time to applying to things, to like putting yourself out there, applying to grants for funding, which there aren't like a huge amount of anyway, and it's so competitive. But that's part of our job.
So how many hours a week would you say you spend on that sort of thing?
I take a full day a week to just do kind of that sort of admin applications, looking for opportunities, refining my artist statement, going over all of my documents, writing about myself, which in itself is a weird thing. You're writing about yourself and your own skills, which sometimes can be uncomfortable, but you really need to learn to to believe in yourself, which doesn't come naturally to a lot of artists, I think. There's a reason we've chosen to work on our own and for ourselves.
Yeah.
So that's tricky. And I've applied for a lot of things. It was a really great opportunity to be showing at Future Heritage last year. That was just through a connection that I made with Corinne, and that was a big opportunity that has led to more opportunities.
Yeah.
So they kind of come gradually,
but
also it's not linear. I've learnt that, that my career could be going like this and then plummet back down again, and it gets quiet, and it's really hard to make a living.
So are there things that you've maybe applied for, weren't successful, and then maybe applied for again?
Yes, constantly. I think not giving up on applications is really important. But for example, this year, recently, I learned that I won the Developing Your Creative Practice grant from the Arts Council, which is really exciting. Yeah, I had like a full day of blasting music and dancing around in the studio.
I'm not surprised, because I've heard that's a really, really hard one to get.
Yeah, and I applied for it twice in the past and didn't get it, and oh my God, receiving the email saying that you don't get it is horrible. Because it kind of knocks your self-belief as well. And in this game, our job is to constantly try and believe in ourselves, so it's really hard. But yeah, I brought up actually my 2 applications from the past with this one that was successful, and I can see the leaps and bounds that I've made in terms of what I'm asking for, what I want to develop.
You've sort of gained some clarity.
Yeah, I think so, and really understanding where I want to take my work in the future. And so that has really taken a huge amount of pressure off for now, for the rest of this year. So I applied for a period of 9 months, and within that I get to pay myself to be here doing the work for 2 full days a week, which is hugely helpful, and my material costs are covered, and I get to seek mentorship from someone I've been really wanting to talk to for ages about milk.
Amazing.
And do a couple of workshops that actually are going to be with someone who worked in fashion, specifically learning stitching techniques and smocking techniques and stuff. So it's kind of developing my technical skill and the conceptual side of it, and yeah.
That's great. Because it's like supporting you not just financially, but also from a development perspective,
yeah, exactly.
right?
Because I would never have been able to put my money towards hiring a one-on-one tutor to teach me these things. So much of my stuff is self-taught.
Yeah.
But you can't, it's so important to seek advice and skills and knowledge from outside of your own kind of skill base. And so access to those kind of funds allow people to do that. It's just a shame that there aren't more of them, and it's a shame. Yeah, they're so competitive. There are so many people who need the money.
That's the thing, because there's so few of these funds, it then means that the pressure on them is that much higher. So it's really, really tricky.
Yeah.
And what about your relationship to shows and galleries and things like that?
I've mainly shown or sold work through a gallery that I'm represented by in New York, and that's been since 2019, and the curator just found me on Instagram. That was very Amazing. He just liked bits of my work. I'm constantly thinking that I want to get rid of Instagram, and then I'm like, no, you do get work through it. People do see the stuff you're putting out there. But other than that, so I developed a relationship with him, and I send these pieces to the States, and I really enjoy that kind of relationship with a curator when you're getting to know them and understand working with specific galleries, because you're the person doing the making and you can tell your story to a certain extent, but I see gallerists and curators, and also what you're doing here, you're essentially a storyteller. There needs to be this middleman that kind of screams from the rooftops the stories of all of these people that are making this stuff, because we can't all do it ourselves. So yeah, it's developing relationships with people on the outside world that can kind of help. And I didn't realise initially how this was fully just based on word of mouth and meeting people.
You need to have sort of almost like ambassadors, I guess, for your work, right?
Yeah, and it's scary because it means you need to go to all of the private views and meet all the people and introduce yourself to people. which I'm not very good at. I'm learning to be better at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is about, you know, giving people your story. Like, we all have like a story behind our work and a reason for making the things we make, and it's about someone else translating that to the clients and the collectors and the buyers, because between artists and buyers there's a huge gap there, right? It's you know, it's a small percent of people that can afford to buy art. And artists don't generally mix with that crowd. So we need the middlemen.
Yeah, and I think that's the difficulty with finding gallery representation is, as you say, like Instagram is one way, but in order to, you know, even just Instagram, and we're not even talking about like a physical show, which physical shows cost a lot of money to take part in, but even Instagram, you need to have made the work and you need to have photographed the work. I mean, like all of these things, there's a sort of barrier to entry already, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. You need, I mean, you need the money to front being able to make the pieces. And you can put a certain amount of little bits of work out there, but essentially I've learned that people aren't skilled in a way of using their imagination at what could be done. You need to actually show the work and put the work out there, a finished piece, in order for people to understand, okay, that's what that could look like, and that's something more could be done with that. So there's a constant cycle with having to get funding or sell pieces in order to invest in yourself again, in order to make new pieces, in order to gain more traction and to make yourself more attractive to galleries and to show that you can constantly be evolving your practice. And I find, I mean, it's really tricky because I'm really lucky actually in that my material doesn't cost loads. The time, it's very time consuming, but I don't have to spend lots of money on the materials itself. But that's a huge barrier when you're paying for studio rents.
I was going to say, you still have the overheads of a studio and stuff like that. So it's not... there's still a lot of things to consider. And especially if, as you say, you then have like a day a week already taken away with just applying for things.
Yeah, and sometimes that can pay off and sometimes it can't for ages. Yeah, exactly. But I think that's, you know, that's why I worked 4 days a week alongside very slowly developing this for years and years and years. And that just stopped, as I mentioned, because of the pandemic, really. So I was almost like forced into... okay, I need to make my own work now, sell my own work and make a bit of a shift. And it's always up and down. This year, until winning the grant, there have been lots of opportunities, but you also find that a lot of them aren't financial opportunities.
Right.
Opportunities to show work in group shows. People being interested in your work is amazing, and you always want to partake in shows, but you have to make the money, and you learn that it's actually not that common that someone just walks into a group show and says, I'm going to buy that, and then you get money from it. So it's a very slow process of building up some sort of a name for yourself, and people need to recognise your work, understand it.
Yeah.
Which with something as experimental as this can be really challenging as well.
Yeah. Because we've just taken quite a lot of time sort of like unpacking this from the process, the materials, the historical inspiration, etc. Like, it's not something, you know, everyone's always like, oh, elevator pitch, like, you know, a few seconds, and it's like, you can't talk about this in a few seconds. It's actually it's quite complex.
So it is very hard to translate and for people to understand, and I come up with quite a lot of barriers of people, which I find interesting, which is why I also call myself an artist, of people being like, oh, milk, no. Being really like grossed out by it.
But like everyone
I know.
drink or has drunk milk
Everyone
at some point.
has. Maybe, you know, some people don't want to live around it or with it, but that's why there are just so many layers to understanding the story, and it is really hard to kind of sell in that one kind of elevator pitch kind of method.
Yeah.
And
I guess also there's, from the financial aspect again, like, you know, I think you've mentioned that Corinne Julius is very sort of like supportive in the ways she's set up Future Heritage. You know, you don't have a sort of upfront fee to pay to take part, but that's quite unusual actually, because a lot of shows and opportunities will come with a upfront price tag, and then you also might have a commission added to that. And it's like, you know, you said to me like, oh, a commission seems fair, but the upfront price tag when you have no certainty that you will sell anything, that's the thing that can be really difficult.
I think that's, again, like more funding for people to be able to put money towards that stuff. I don't agree to do any shows where I have to pay for the space, and I don't know if that's right or wrong. I might be missing out on opportunities in doing that, but the idea of fronting money to kind of be in a space, and then I'm also the person there that has to talk about the work, it just feels like what it does is it means that only privileged people can afford to make the work and be there showing the work, and so you get this really narrow, one-dimensional view of the artistic landscape.
And that's something that you mentioned to me off camera, is that, you know, having gone through this state school system, when you then went to art college, all of a sudden it was mostly people from public schools there.
Yeah, a lot of people from public schools, a bit of a mix, but you know, it is a privileged profession to go into. This is why we talked about, I chose to do architecture and then design, because I wanted to be employable afterwards. I didn't really feel like I had I could afford to be an artist, because that seems like just a very privileged position to be in. And I've kind of gradually, after many years, gotten to the point of allowing myself to be called an artist, or calling myself an artist. But it's taken a lot of hard work.
Yeah. No, it is. It is a very sort of like privilege-led industry, I think. And as you know, an interviewer, I'm trying to find people from diverse backgrounds. You know, I mean, for me, it's always going to be like the work first, right? Like the work has to be great, it has to tell a story, but I do want to, you know, give space to diverse voices. But I'm realizing that it's going to be tough to do that, because as you say, like there's a certain amount of like, well, does someone have the opportunity, and you know, is someone able to afford to do that?
I think it's about not really giving so much esteem to the formal training as well. Like the place I went, the Royal College of Art, has got this huge like name over it, and actually there are more and more things popping up, like make your own masters and like different ways of training, apprenticeships that don't mean that you have to pay to go to a fancy college. Like I could have done without it, to be honest. I was very lucky. My dad worked really, really hard in order for me to do that. But like I think kind of giving these institutions the amount of power that they have does contribute to that, to this kind of gap in the people that are able to put their work out there.
Yeah, because as it stands, it's almost like that cachet, isn't it? Of like, oh yeah, like so and so went to this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, it just also begins in terms of educational, like free education, free access to being able to engage in the arts. Yeah, I feel like it seems like a luxury, even though art is a driver for change and it creates culture. But if people's basic needs aren't met, then they don't have the emotional or mental capacity to make art or engage in creativity. And that needs to stem from, you know, our basic services being provided to us. So when the government talks about taking away free school meals or changing the NHS and housing cuts, there's a butterfly effect, right, that is going to affect all of the creative industries, because people don't have the capacity to be able to thrive and engage in something that might seem like a luxury, but is actually really fundamental to creating
and
our
I
culture.
think that's, well, exactly, because that's the thing, is like art is the witness of society, and if you make it so that certain parts of society can't make art, then you're like reducing that like diversity of narrative.
Yeah, and then it's boring.
Yeah.
And then the creative landscape is, as I said, one-dimensional and boring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so important. You're actually involved with education as well, aren't you?
Yes, I do bits of teaching, but mainly through a collective called Store Projects that I'm part of, and I've done work with kind of in and out since 2019. And their store works kind of towards the collective goal of making education more accessible, and so
that ties into your purpose, basically.
Yeah, it's really fun and great to do those kind of educational workshops alongside this. So we work with students from state schools, and I say we, there are people doing like loads of work on this full time, and I have dipped in and out and done like milk vases workshops for kind of GCSE students and younger, where we kind of have after school clubs and take them through different craft practices essentially and design practices, and it's really useful. And that is I know that the work, even to find funding for that, is really, really, really difficult. But it's there and it's existing, and I hope that people know about it and can have access to it, because it's open for anyone essentially.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love that you're able to do that and sort of look after hopefully the next generation of
when I say that
as well.
when I say that I'm not willing to like give my exact recipe over, that is only to certain demographics of people, but when it comes to students, like young students,
it's inspiring them and giving them that space to be creative, and
I think there's no point in me having done all of this training and work if I'm just going to be sitting with it in my own studio. It's about it, it makes a lot of sense to be teaching and introducing a future generation to the like really weird things they could be doing one day maybe, or inspiring them to kind of ask questions and to experiment with stuff and to embrace failure. All of this stuff that I've learned that has been difficult might as well be passed on.
Absolutely. Because I feel like you've got to be sort of quietly confident to be able to sort of like launch into this experimental process of trial and error and work out an entirely new method from the known materials the way that you've done.
It's stubbornness or confidence or what it is. I don't think it's come from confidence. I think it's come from just wanting to play around and try. That's what it started from. To do something different. But I love that you've like every stage of the process is sort of like adapted and made your own, and you've had to work it out on your own way. Last question from me. What would be your dream commission? I can think of loads, but just loads of commissions this year would be great. But I think one thing that I always think of is the limitation of like the size of a studio and how difficult it is to put your energy and your money and your time towards making something of a larger scale. So I would love to scale up the work, and there's a piece that I showed at Future Heritage, which is kind of a large central table leg that had a glass tabletop on it, and that was the largest thing I made to date. But I would love, for example, for that to be one pillar that kind of contributes to like 4 legs on a huge dining table, or a big column, or something that is really involves scaling up. But I'd need the commission in order to fund it, because it's not something that I can just front on my own. So there's this, it relates back to that cycle of the money coming in and you spending the money and investing it on your stuff. But that would be great to work way bigger.
Amazing. Well, I certainly hope that commission comes your way, and but it's great as well to hear that you've had the funding from DYCP, and hopefully there'll be more things like that as well to support your practice.
I hope so. I hope so.
Well, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much.
I've linked Tessa's website below so you can see more photos of her finished pieces. And I'd love to hear in the comments below what most surprised you about her work. For me, it was her research into sour milk and chalk floors, and I'd love to go visit Alfriston Clergy House to see it firsthand. Thank you for watching, it means a lot, especially as at the moment this channel is entirely self-funded. So please spread the word. Like, share and subscribe. See you next week. Sort of opportunities, oh my god.
Doing well.
Yeah, exactly. Failing at being an interviewer today. Great.
Yeah.